Good morning. I'm doing a short and very upsetting book today. It's called A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies by Bartolomé de las Casas. Apparently, they're assigning this book in school now, which I think is great. I was definitely not taught this in school, so I thought I would share what I learned from it. And basically, this is just exactly what it says. So, Bartolomé de las Casas was a Spanish friar. He was like a religious functionary in the Spanish invading armies of like 1492 and around there. So he sort of gives a first-hand account of what happened in the Americas in the first few years after Columbus and co. landed. So pretty much all of it is right here on the first page. He says, America was discovered and found out in 1492, and the years ensuing inhabited by the Spaniards, and afterward a multitude of them traveled thither from Spain for the space of 49 years. Their first attempt was on the Spanish islands, so that's what the natives called Haiti or Haiti or something like that. Today it's Haiti in the Dominican Republic. They just called it Hispaniola, the Spanish island. It's on all sides surrounded with an almost innumerable number of islands, which we found so well peopled with natives and foreigners that there is scarce any region in the universe fortified with so many inhabitants. Such a multitude of people inhabits these countries that it seems as if the omnipotent God has assembled and convocated the major part of mankind in this part of the world. So this just goes against the lie that I was taught in school and that you're taught in movies and books and stuff, which is that the Americas were mostly uninhabited when white people landed, which is just not true. Even the most conservative, like white academic estimates now say that there were more people in the Americas than in Europe in 1491, and I think that's a very conservative estimate still. So now it gets really, really dark. So if you don't want to hear really grotesque, horrible things, then you can tab out of this video. So the Spaniards studied nothing for the space of 40 years after their first landing but the massacre of these wretches. I think wretches just means like poor, sad people. And so he says, of 3 million, these are obviously estimates because they didn't have a census or anything, but of 3 million persons who lived in Hispaniola itself, there's at present but the inconsiderable remnant of scarce 300. Cuba lies uncultivated like a desert. St. John and Jamaica, both large and fruitful places, unpeopled and desolate. Just goes on and on and on, describing how all of these formerly super bountiful, rich places are completely laying barren now. And again, he saw this with his own eyes. This is not a secondhand account. This is not like 100 years later describing what happened. He actually saw this. The Spaniards, by their barbarous and execrable actions, have absolutely depopulated 10 kingdoms of greater extent than all Spain. And then now it's a description of just the violence and horror that happened here. So the Spaniards spared no age or sex, nay, not so much as woman with child, but ripping up their bellies, tore them alive in pieces. They snatched young babes from mothers' breasts and dashed out the brains of those innocents against the rocks. Others they cast into rivers, scoffing and jeering. They burned people alive. They trained their dogs to just to eat natives as food. That's where the word bloodhounds comes from. And if it ever happened that the indigenous people tried to kill a Spaniard, they made a law that said 100 Indians should die for every individual Spaniard that should be slain. That's pretty much the main point of the book. It goes on that he describes in each individual kingdom what happened, and it's just like horror after horror, the same thing over and over again. So he's describing the 6 kingdoms that are there in Hispaniola. If any place in the universe deserves taking notice of and memorable for the pleasantness of its situation, mountains and rivers. I mean, this is like an equatorial region. If anyone's been to the DR, it's like a very beautiful, naturally gorgeous place. He's just talking about all these kingdoms that are totally destroyed. It's rich in mines of gold. There's literally just gold flowing everywhere. they crucified a queen. I just don't. I mean, like, I thought the whole point of Christianity was that crucifixion, whatever. Like, I just don't understand a lot of this. And then once the war was over, because this was a war, this was an invading army, and they treated the local population as enemy combatants, including the civilians. So once the war was over, they treated everyone as prisoners of war, and so they divided up the young men, women, and children. They sent the men to the mines, and the women to manure and till the ground, like beasts. They made use of them as beasts to carry the burdens of their journeys. It just keeps going. So this is one thing that is a little bit new and different. So there was an indigenous person from, I think it said Cuba, who escaped, he fled Hispaniola to Cuba. And he gathered together all the local people, or as many as he could get together, and told them what was happening. And, this is like a person from a neighboring kingdom comes and he gives a speech, and he basically says the white people are coming, they're very scary and dangerous, and he says they adore a certain covetous deity whose cravings are not to be satisfied by a few moderate offerings. And then he holds up a cask full of gold, and he says, "This is the Spaniards' God." So I mean, this whole thing raises the question of why did this happen and why did they do this? And this is one answer, is that it was for gold, which I think just raises a further question that I really can't, that I'll look for another book to post about that. But sort of how did Spain and how did the countries of Europe become so obsessed with gold that something like this could happen? Because of course, to the native people, they had no understanding of why gold was useful or valuable to them. I mean, there's a story in here about this is one like kingdom where a prince, everyone tried all different things. So this one prince entertained the Spaniards with fraternal kindness, even though knowing that they had just like destroyed island after island. They were courteously received, and of his own accord, he presented the captain with a gift of 15,000 Spanish crowns, so just a ton of gold. And so the Spaniards see this and they think, well, if he's just going to give us that much gold for free, he must have way more gold than that. So they pretended to leave, and then 4 nights later, in the middle of the night, they come back and they burn the city to the ground and kill all the civilians and steal 50 or 60,000 crowns. And then everyone who survives gets sent to the mines. Again, it feels like it needs more historical context. And so I did like a little bit more research because, the question that came to me was who authorized this? Because this was a royal, like, approved voyage of the Spanish crown. So what was going on in Spain at the time? And basically it seems like what had just happened in Spain was like something like what we would today consider like a fascist takeover, or the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon had just been united in marriage. And then in 1492, the same year that this was starting, is when the Spanish Inquisition started. So they passed an ordinance saying that everyone had to be Catholic or they had to leave or convert. So a bunch of Jews and Muslims, a lot of Muslims were still in the south of Spain, a lot of Jews were there for a while, and they were all expelled. That's where Sephardic Jews come from. That's where a lot of the Muslims who went back to northern Africa, I say went back, but these people, of course, had lived in Spain their whole life. But yeah, and then also I think it's worth connecting this back to the Crusades, which is something that I'm still trying to learn more about, which is that it needs to be remembered that all of the armies of Europe were originally founded as crusading armies. So, in the 1000s, Europe was like a pretty sparsely populated agricultural region. After the fall of Rome, it's like Rome had fallen 600 years ago, and all of the old Roman roads were still like there and crumbling, and that was the only infrastructure. And like the big cities like Paris and London, there were only like tens of thousands of people there. So really, this is like not a super centralized region. There's not a lot of like armies or anything. And then they learn through pilgrimages and stuff like that, that Arab Muslims have, meanwhile, the Arab Muslims are going through what we call the Golden Age, which is a Eurocentric term, but they invented math and science. They built the Library of Baghdad, which collects all the writings from around the world. They have all these gorgeous not cathedrals, obviously, mosques and just buildings. And basically, the Christians from the West learn that Jerusalem is this like flourishing Muslim paradise, and the Pope collects a bunch of bishops together and says we need to go take back Jerusalem and make it Christian again. And so basically all of these different like areas of Europe, all these different Christian areas of Europe come together, and they organize armies. All these men who were just like regular citizens, they get a horse, they get chainmail, and they form these armies. And these orders of knights, these like like the Teutonic Knights, which later became Prussia, which later became Germany. All of these armies that became the countries of Europe were founded as crusading armies. So with that context, I guess it's not too hard to imagine that sort of a little shift in local politics could lead to, and they're all competing with each other after the Crusades. There's just like, what do we do with these armies? They're sort of all pillaging each other. And so there's constant competition to have more and more military might, collect more and more gold and resources. And so then they start looking outward. And, in this case, this government of Spain authorizes a mission to go plunder some islands. And they didn't realize when they plundered, Haiti, that it would, they didn't realize that the Americas were there. But it didn't stop them, So anyway, really depressing and upsetting book, but I think this is important historical context just in terms of everything that's happened in the Americas since 1492. That's it for today.